Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so glad you've joined me for part 2 of our story tonight, because it's getting very exciting, and we've got another bad man this week. So, let's continue with our story. No, you won't, Eddie. You've done quite enough damage already, came Dean's voice. Dean was standing in the doorway. He'd seen the whole thing. He kicked Eddie hard in the groin. You tried to kill my mother. You'll pay for this big time, Eddie. Dean did not care that Eddie was in a bad way, as blood was pouring out of his body fast. Dean wouldn't care if Eddie had died on the spot. None of them would have cared. I always knew you were a nasty piece of work, Eddie. Look what you've done. You tried to kill our mother tonight. You're a drunk. You really are. I don't even think you know what you're doing. I'm calling the police. I hope they lock you up and throw away the key. If it wasn't for my brave little sister here, my mother might be dead. Mama was choking, clutching her neck, struggling to breathe. She was badly bruised and violently shaking from the shock. Finally she managed to speak. He was trying to kill me, Dean. He was strangling me. Can you believe that? I couldn't breathe. Dean cradled Mama in his arms, rocking her backwards and forwards. Eddie lay in a crumpled heap on the ground and appeared to be in much pain. He was groaning, clutching his body, begging them to call an ambulance for him. I'm dying here. I'm dying here. I'm losing far too much blood. You need to call for help. The emergency services arrived, and the men hurriedly whisked Eddie off to hospital. He began to lose consciousness. Mama went to hospital for an examination and to have pictures of her bruising taken by the police, where she filed reports against Eddie. Chloe and Dean gave witness accounts about how their mother had narrowly escaped losing her life to a deranged killer. When Chloe confessed to hiding out in the bathroom, Mama did not get cross with her. Indeed, Mama told Chloe she was very brave and that she'd saved Mama's life. And after that, Mama did not mind Chloe trying on all her clothes and jewellery, or playing dress-up as much as she liked. You saved my life, my little sweet pea, Mama had told her. And Dean, her brother, had been telling her what a hero she was, especially when after the court case, Eddie was sentenced to 25 years in jail for attempted murder, and Mama was incredibly happy that he was locked away for a long time. One day when Chloe was in her teens, she heard the postman rattling at the door and realised that the post had arrived. She went over to retrieve the post, sifting through it curiously. Most of it appeared to be bills, but there was a letter addressed to her in a spidery writing that she did not recognise. Chloe never received personal post, except on Valentine's Day, when she'd get a few red envelopes flung through the postbox from a couple of male admirers. But a strange letter like this was an oddity. But when she saw the postage stamp, her heart sank, especially when she realised the letter had been posted to her from a prison inmate. Her heart began to pound violently in her chest. Her fingers trembled. It couldn't be. No, surely not. No way. Chloe staggered awkwardly to the kitchen, making herself a cup of coffee with double the amount of sugar and coffee creamer. She knocked back a few mouthfuls, and once her fingers had steadied, she tore back the manila envelope. She wished she hadn't opened it at all. It was worse than she could have ever imagined. In the same spidery writing were the words, I haven't forgotten what you did, Chloe. And then the words, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You know what that means, don't you, Chloe? Vengeance is mine. When Chloe received the first letter, she was absolutely terrified, and over the years many more just like that came through the post for her. Chloe never told anyone about the threats that she had received in the post. But when she learnt that Eddie was coming out of prison early for good behaviour, her fears were confounded. She felt absolutely certain that her life was in perilous danger. She was 28 years old at the time, when Eddie was due to come out of prison. Chloe had an 8-year-old daughter called Tina, whom she'd protect with her life if needs must, and she couldn't allow that thug Eddie to get anywhere near her daughter. Chloe was currently going through a divorce with her husband Nick, so after her separation, she'd moved in with her mother into her old family home. Mama took care of her granddaughter while Chloe was at work. It would seem these days Chloe was incredibly close with her mother, but she had never told her about the ominous letters she'd received from Eddie over the years. Her mother did not need to be exposed to that kind of stress, because it would probably destroy her. She had never fully recovered from nearly being strangled to death by her boyfriend, and since then she was very cautious about any relationship she had with men, and was no longer as fun-loving and carefree as she used to be. Coming close to losing your life can change you exponentially. Dean did not live far from Mama's house. He was married now with children of his own, but he was incredibly protective towards Mama these days, always checking up on her to make sure she was all right. And no one was happy about the news that Eddie was coming out of prison. And when Mama had learnt the dreadful news, she'd broken out into a sizable sweat on her forehead, her eyes growing wide with terror, and her whole body physically shaking. "He's coming out of prison! Did you hear that, Dean? For good behaviour! What if he comes after me?" Mama had said, dabbing away frantically at the sweat with her handkerchief. "You forget, Dean. I know what he's like. That man cannot take rejection of any kind. What if he comes after me again and finishes off what he started? I'm sure he's got a memory on him like an elephant. You do know his mother died in mysterious circumstances after he had a fight with her. She was found lying in a ditch outside a bar with a gunshot in her head. No one knew what happened to her. But when Eddie told me the story, he was so evasive about the facts. After Eddie tried to strangle me that night, I often wondered if he got so capriciously angry with his mother that he was the one that had shot her. You can never be sure about that. I know after he strangled me, well, attempted to, the police regarded him as a person of interest in his own mother's death. But they can't prove a thing. The neighbours claim they heard Eddie threatening to kill his mother over and over again, and many believe he did. Supposing he does come after me, Dean, I'm so scared. You must remember, I'm the very reason he's in prison, am I not? If he hadn't attempted to strangle me, he wouldn't be there." "Don't you worry, Mama. The police will be keeping tabs on his whereabouts all the time. He will not be allowed to be anywhere near you, and I will be watching over you like a hawk. You can bet on that. If that man gets anywhere near you, Mama, I'll personally kill him myself. Do you understand?" said Dean, growling furiously. When Chloe had heard the bitter news, she wanted to faint. It wasn't Mama who had received threatening letters in the post from Eddie over the years. It had been her. She had been hearing from the vengeful prison inmate, although more recently the letters had stopped, but her mother confiding in them about Eddie being the likely offender in his own mother's demise certainly gave Chloe pause for thought, making her feel all the more wretchedly vulnerable. Chloe felt convinced that Eddie, on learning she had a daughter, would do his utmost to harm Tina. What better way to destroy a woman's life than harm her own child? That would be the ultimate form of revenge. What had he written to her? Chloe squirmed as she tried to recall his messages, her stomach recoiling in knots. "I haven't forgotten what you've done, Chloe. An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Vengeance is mine." "What if he comes after me?" she asked Dean, choosing not to tell him about the threatening letters she'd received over the years. "I mean, I am the one that stabbed him with the scissors over and over again. You must remember that. He could come after me." "You did what you had to do, Chloe, to save Mama's life. It was instinctive for you. He could be in death row now, or at the very least spending his life in prison, if you hadn't stopped him from killing Mother." "That's not the point, Dean. I'm the one that nearly killed him. The doctor said he was lucky to still be alive, because he lost so much blood." "Well, it's a pity he didn't die," said Dean reluctantly. "In my book, you did what you had to do, Chloe, to save Mama's life. It was instinctive for you, and you were only 9 years old at the time.
If it wasn't for you, think about it. He could be in death row, or at the very least spending his entire lifetime in prison."
"That's not the point, Dean. You know it isn't. I'm the one that nearly killed him. You know what the doctor said. He was lucky to be alive because he'd lost so much blood."
"Well, it's a pity then he didn't die, isn't it?" said Dean, spitting furiously. "I wish to God they'd locked him up in prison for good. A man like him should never be let out. You mark my words, he's dangerous. I don't know what Mama ever saw in him. She used to have nice boyfriends until he came along. I heard a rumour somewhere that he'd found God in prison. I don't buy that for a second. It's just a ruse. He's probably a wolf in sheep's clothing, hiding behind the charade of being a Christian all the time."
It was an anxious countdown until Eddie Jones was due to get out of prison, and if Mama was discomposed, no one was more disquieted and apprehensive than Chloe was. She was rigidly certain that Eddie would be after her, and had no way of confiding in anyone about her overwrought state of mind. For at the very best of times, Chloe was quite a reticent, reserved person, who clandestinely buried her troubles away from the world. It was almost as if she was terribly afraid that if she confessed her grievances to anyone, that it would make them all the more real to her. Chloe had never been quite the same girl ever again, since that fateful, pretentious, dreadful night when she had lunged a pair of scissors into Eddie's back, again and again and again. In a heartbeat, Eddie had stolen her youthful innocence away, robbing her insouciantly of her fun-loving childhood, for her eyes had seen far too much on that bodeful, gloomy night. And some things you just can't unsee, no matter how hard you try to scribble and erase those haunting images away from your mind. The fear in Mama's eyes, the inscrutable rage on Eddie's face that had grown purple with indignance, and her mother's desperate little whimpers. She had come a hair's breadth from killing Eddie, and Chloe couldn't even hurt a spider. But she did not mind admitting she wished with all her heart that Eddie Jones was dead, for now the impending threat of his dark, tenebrific shadow loomed over her life like a foreboding thundercloud, and she was dreadfully afraid that that man would come after her, and fear could do strange things to a person. It rarely could. It was when Chloe was enjoying a coffee in the cafeteria at work. She heard two women talking together over their coffees. She knew both of them rather remotely, but Kathy Driscoll had worked with her for a while in the offices, until she got promoted to a higher level in the company. But that woman wore her heart on her sleeve, talking freely about her life. So there really wasn't much about Kathy Driscoll that people did not know. The woman was as transparent as an open book. Chloe found herself surreptitiously eavesdropping, hanging on to every word that Kathy was saying. Indeed, she had remembered when Kathy had been working in the offices in the past, talking about her uncle's cabin. But back then, Chloe had no interest in such matters, but now paying attention to every word. "No, it's up in the Cascades in Oregon. That's right, it's near Mount Hood, you know," she told Bronwyn Esterhazen, who people called Bron for short. "When I say it's off the beaten track, I mean that quite literally. It's got electricity and running water, but it's about as rustic as you can get. It can be problematic during storms when the cabin is predisposed to having power failures, which is a bit freaky, I have to say, because who wants to have a complete blackout in the middle of the sticks like that? Mind you, my Uncle Tucker keeps paraffin lamps and torches for such emergencies," she told her friend. "It's nestled in the middle of the woods, on a high elevation. I haven't been there for years, actually. I had the time of my life there as a girl, with my sisters and brothers making snowmen and going tobogganing. You felt like you were the only people in the world up there. It's so beautiful, so prepossessing. The views are exquisite. I don't think my uncle has been back there for 5 years, but he says I can use the place whenever I want to. I don't want to go back because of all those wistful childhood memories, you know. I suspect the place is a little run down these days. Let's not kid. It's in the middle of nowhere. But get this, he leaves the key right under the mat. I mean, who does that? Especially if you're away from a place for a long time."
Isn't that a bit risky? Came Bron's voice. I mean, someone could use the cabin without your uncle knowing about it, especially if he hasn't been back there for years. I know, he's crazy. But I guess the place being so remote, I mean, who would ever stumble across a place in passing like that? It's very unlikely, you have to admit. Oh, I suppose you're right, but even so, I wouldn't leave a key under the mat. It was when Chloe had overheard all of this. An idea was born in her head. She'd done some intensive research on the internet, checking county and state records, along with personal information she should not have known about, but she did. It was amazing the details you could glean out of people if needs must. She found out that the owner of the remote cabin was called Tucker Montgomery, and from a map she thought she knew where she could locate the mysterious cabin. She had taken 3 weeks off work, told her mother she was going away to New York for a while, which was far from the truth, but you couldn't be too careful, and she didn't want anyone to know where she could be found. She had taken cash with her, a burner phone, and basic provisions to last a few weeks, and journeyed up to the Cascades in Oregon in her SUV with her daughter Tina. Chloe parked discreetly behind some snow-covered trees. She was hoping she'd be able to hide out in Tucker's cabin for a while, if no one had used it in years. It would be an excellent location to stay hidden. She knew she was being irrational, and what she was doing made no sense at all. But it's amazing how common sense flies out of the window when you're living on your adrenaline. The perennial memories of Eddie's threats that he'd sent to her over the years, in his ugly, spider-like scrawl, bellowed in her mind intrusively like a booming drum, taunting and teasing her thoughts. So a dreadful sense of foreboding clung to her like a blood-sucking leech that she simply could not shake off. It would seem now that he was hours away from being released from prison. Chloe was on tenterhooks and wanted to be as far away from that treacherous man as she could possibly get. As awful images of him leaving prison with a 9mm Glock pistol in his hands or a Remington high-powered rifle was just too unthinkable for words. Chloe needed to get the hell away. She saw his threats as intentional. He wanted to pay her back for coming a hair's breadth away from killing him with those scissors, all those years ago, as a young 9-year-old girl. Chloe was reminded of the story her mother Christy had told her about, regarding Eddie's own mother having been found lying dead outside a bar in a ditch, smelling strongly of alcohol. The people had been unable to pin the blame on Eddie, as he was as sly as a fox and had managed to conjure up some sketchy alibi. He'd likely do the same to Chloe, or something far worse, she thought. The man would aim for the jugular by harming Chloe's beloved daughter instead of Chloe. That also was a distinct possibility. Chloe would give her life over 1,000-fold for her daughter, and Eddie would likely know this. So Chloe was certain that she and her daughter were in perilous danger. Maybe he wanted to harm the both of them. According to Dean, Eddie had found Jesus in prison, but she was not going to trust that promise, for people often hid behind religion to shield their heinous deeds. More recently, her husband had been defrauded by a man, claiming to be a Christian, and for that reason, Nick had put his trust in him and had lost a considerable amount of money as a result. She was sure that Eddie would likely play a similar game, so no one would suspect him of murder. He probably had deceived all the prison guards in prison, believing that he had changed, but Chloe believed people as duplicitous as Eddie simply could not change, for the man was hardwired to be cruel. Even all these years later, she wondered how her mother had ever been attracted to such a sinister, unhinged character like Eddie Jones. "I don't know, darling," her mother admitted. "Maybe I fancy dating a bad boy for a change. I was completely insane going out with the likes of him. People warned me he wasn't a good sort, you know, but I never paid any attention to what they told me." Chloe would never forget those cruel eyes that burned into hers across the breakfast table as a 9-year-old girl. And she never forgot the day he pinned down her mother, nearly strangling her to death. All these years later, she was still haunted very graphically by those images of his thick calloused fingers crushing her mother's neck, and no amount of post-traumatic stress trauma counselling had ironed away those brutal images, which the counsellor had assured her would fade away in time, but they never had. In truth, Chloe had found the counselling only made things 1,000 times worse, in her opinion, as talking about what had happened just brought it back to life all over again. It was so much better to bury things away, forget about them. After all, out of sight was out of mind. She didn't doubt her mother and brother were safe. Neither of them had received threatening letters from Eddie over the years. It was Chloe he was after. It was she whom had nearly killed him. Eddie made it clear that vengeance was his, so Chloe would stop at nothing to keep herself and her daughter Tina safe. But what was she going to do long term? She wasn't sure. How could she hide from this monster indefinitely? She was thinking of applying for a job in Alaska to get far away from California. But wherever she went in the world, she was sure he'd be close behind her, breathing down her neck. There was a very strong likelihood that Eddie would find her, no matter where she went, for that man had an unmatched resolute determination. She had seen it herself when he was dating her mother. The man did not know the meaning of the word no. It was as foreign to him as the skin on his own backside. So that was why Chloe was out here in Oregon, exhausted after her trip, but so glad to be here. It was a nightmare pulling the rope as they dragged the sledge piled with their possessions up the hilly incline, as everything was swathed in thick carpets of white snow, and it was freezing cold. Her daughter Tina kept complaining about the walk and how freezing she was. Suffice to say, as they walked through the snow, they left behind a long trail of tracks, which Chloe could only hope would be buried under carpets of pristine snow the following morning.
Mama, I can't feel my fingers. The wind is hitting my face so hard,
Tina moaned.
How long before we find the cabin, Mama? I'm tired. My leg is hurting.
Both mother and daughter were breathing furiously. The air was so cold they could see their own breaths before their faces. Chloe kept reassuring Tina that they were nearly there, which was a barefaced lie, as Chloe had no idea where the cabin was, but she could only hope it wasn't too far away. She thought it was probably still over 1/2 mile to go, up the steep trail to the cabin that was tucked away in the heart of the woods among the trees. Chloe hoped that after all these years the cabin hadn't been used and that the key still remained under the mat, but there were no guarantees about anything. Chloe had felt the risk was well worth it, for there was nowhere on this entire planet that was far enough to escape the likes of Eddie Jones, whom in Chloe's eyes was far more intimidating than Freddy Krueger or the Grim Reaper himself. They may be fictitious characters in horror movies who could do nothing to you, but Eddie Jones, he was the real deal. He was capable of great wrath. Chloe could so easily visualize him, with an axe in his hand, ready to decapitate her at the very first opportunity, giving her a gormless grin, and the dreadful detailed image sent shivers of dread cascading down her spine, so that every single hair on the back of her neck stood up on edge. Ever since she had arrived here in the Cascades, she had the overwhelming sense that her car had been followed, and that Eddie was behind her, but she knew her sensitivity was off the charts, and that her irrational, far-fetched imagination was polluted rudely by her doubts, and was frenziedly feeding her fears like a hungry pool of piranhas that were gunning for her blood. She couldn't help the nervous trepidation that hung over her, like a clawing mist, disabling her ability to see things clearly, in a more rational, composed state of mind. If her soon-to-be ex-husband had any concept of what she was doing now, he would be very troubled, assuring Chloe that she was overreacting, and he was sure Eddie Jones would leave them alone. He wouldn't want to return to prison, but Nick didn't really comprehend what Eddie Jones was really like. Chloe had got the full measure of him as a 9-year-old girl. Chloe presumed that living in this quaint, isolated, whimsical cabin in the Cascades for a while would be a safe hideout, give her time to think, but the fear that had drawn her to this place in the first place was colder than the icy blasts of wind that flung themselves against her face inauspiciously, tugging the hair away from her cap. The wind rattled, the trees shook their needled boughs angrily, as if they too were protesting the arrival of these two unwelcome strangers,
trespassing on their space. They trudged through the thickets of pine trees, almost as if they knew they were not supposed to be here. For everywhere you looked, the world was an exquisite white winter wonderland, where tall, lofty trees were covered in great carpets of snow that spread itself magnanimously in thick icicles over their needled boughs, so it almost looked ethereal, like the Christmas balls on a tree. The vine maples looked skeletal, their autumn leaves all but a faint memory from the past. They too had not escaped the snow that clung to their boughs, so that their shameful nakedness was now modestly covered in delicate white stockings. This must be it, thought Chloe, sighing with relief, when they finally reached a cabin, along with a couple of outbuildings. She held her breath, for snowflakes were beginning to fall down wildly from the sky. The wind was becoming more feisty, so if this wasn't it, she knew come hell or high water, they'd have to break into the place, or otherwise they'd almost certainly freeze. The walk from the car had been far too long, and had quite literally knocked the wind out of their sails. They were both completely exhausted. The cabin looked like a gingerbread home, with a rather enchanting look about it, made all the more magical by the thick covering of snow that upholstered the roof, that Chloe suspected was hiding a multitude of sins. It had been a wee bit neglected in recent years, but none of that mattered to Chloe. It was a roof over their heads, a safe place to hide out for the time being, and in Chloe's eyes, in the grand scheme of things, that was all she actually cared about. Tina looked at the cabin with a gargantuan smile on her heart-shaped face. She was bedazzled by the place, for in her innocent, childlike eyes she saw only its fairy tale-like qualities. Chloe hoped her zealous enthusiasm would last, but she doubted after a few days spent out here in the freezing weather that her little girl would be quite so enchanted by it in the end.
It's so pretty, Mummy. The cabin, I mean. Are we really going to stay here?
Yes, we are, Chloe reassured her. She parked the sleigh by the side of the cabin, her arms now physically exhausted from the exertion of tugging this tiresome thing uphill. She had no idea she was this unfit. Every part of her body ached. She felt like she was 80 years old, going on 30. Chloe trudged up the steps of the wraparound porch with Tina at her side. It hugged the cabin on every side. Its wooden railings were all cloaked in snow. She found the front door, and a bedraggled mat with a welcome sign so faded you could barely see it any more. She removed one of her gloves off her frozen fingers, fumbling around awkwardly in search of the key. For a brief moment she was convinced it wasn't there, but then she found it. She plunged it into the lock, and thankfully the key turned. The door creaked open. She sighed with relief. The dusty smell that greeted her nose was almost welcome. It was good to get out of the freezing cold air and to be safely indoors, away from the blizzard that was threatening to make its appearance known, as the wind began to howl, sweeping up snow towards the cabin, like a cloud of billowing dust with invisible arms. Mother and daughter wisely kept on their parkas until a fire was burning away happily in the living room, and the flickering orange and red flames brought Chloe much comfort. There was something about the warmth of the fire and the pleasant sounds it made that helped Chloe to feel instantly tranquilized. For a second she was able to forget the face that haunted her every thought, the less than comforting images of Eddie Jones. Luckily the owners of the cabin had a plethora of firewood stacked in the hearth, ready to be lit up after being arranged for so long. It was dry and had caught easily. Mother and daughter wisely kept on their parkas in the living room until a fire was burning away. The fireplace had been stacked with wood, so Chloe had been able to light the fire at once. The flickering orange and red flames brought Chloe much comfort. There was something about the warmth of the fire and the pleasant crackling sounds it made that helped Chloe to feel instantly tranquilized. For a second she was able to forget the face that haunted her every thought, the less than comforting images of Eddie Jones. Chloe set to work removing the dust covers that covered the furnishings. She cleared away cobwebs that floated above the crevices and corners of the ceiling. Despite the fact the cabin had not been used in recent years, it did appear to be in good nick. The furnishings were solid and comfortable,
The water that came out of the squeaking taps did appear to be orange and rather dirty, but then it soon became clear after being run for a while. And the electricity worked, which was a huge blessing. Chloe opened a large can of tomato soup. She arranged their sleeping bags on 2 large couches by the fire. They ate their soup and bread with butter hungrily. Chloe couldn't remember a time when food tasted this good. She had brought along some freeze-dried meals. They were practical to bring to a place like this out in the sticks, but she was pleasantly surprised to find some staples in a very well-stocked pantry, such as bags of pasta, rice, preserves, jams, pickles and canned goods that were still not out of date. So things were looking up for Chloe and her daughter, but she did not know how long they could hide out here, or what her next move ultimately would be. They soon settled down to a daily routine at the cabin, and against all the odds, were beginning to rather enjoy themselves. It was on the 3rd night at the cabin, when mother and daughter were both sound asleep, that Chloe woke up with a start, when her worst fears were realized. She could hear glass being shattered in the entrance hall of the cabin. The crashing sound was so obtrusive it could have woken the living dead. She knew that despite everything, that against all the odds, Eddie Jones had found her. No one breaks into a cabin, in a remote part of the world, in freezing conditions in the dead of night, without duplicitous intentions on their mind, and Chloe could smell danger as clearly as a deer when a mountain lion is hot on its trail. Chloe and her daughter went to bed every night fully clothed in preparation for a disaster like this.
"But why must we go to bed with all our clothes on?"
Tina had asked.
"At home I sleep in my Winnie the Pooh pyjamas. Why must I wear my clothes out here?"
"I know, sweetheart, but we're out in the wild. So one day if we need to run to the car in the middle of the night, we can do so quickly. We won't need to change. We just need to put on our shoes and run."
"But why would we need to do that, Mummy?"
Tina had asked her. "You see, Tina, Mama's been a very naughty girl. We're not supposed to be staying in this cabin. So if the owner returns, we need to run away from him, because he might be very angry if he finds us here. We aren't supposed to be here. We're trespassing on his property." Tina considered her mother's words.
"You mean we're not allowed to be here?"
she asked incredulously. "I'm afraid not, sweetheart. The man who owns this place is very mean. He doesn't like people staying here," she lied to her daughter. "I want to stay here because it's so pretty, but we want to make sure that we get out here in an emergency if the owner comes back. Otherwise he might be belligerently angry with us for staying here without his permission. Would you not be cross if someone was staying in your bedroom without asking you first, while you were away? How would you feel about that?" Chloe thought about it for a moment.
I'd be very cross if they played with all my things and they slept in my bed and they didn't ask me, because that is very, very rude. I'd let them stay if they asked me, because I'm not mean like that. But I don't want them to play with any of my dolls, especially not Cindy."
"Well, there you go then. Now you understand, don't you?" Chloe was heartily relieved that she had made Tina understand the need to escape the cabin in an emergency. Chloe had this overwhelming sense that despite her very best intentions to keep Tina and herself safe from harm's way, that somewhere down the line things could potentially go pear-shaped. Someone must have followed her here. Chloe's daughter was now trembling in terror.
"Mummy, I think the owner's come back. Someone's in our cabin."
Chloe nodded. "I know, sweetheart. He must be back. We're going to have to make our way back to the car very discreetly. We don't want him to hear us or see us," she said, opening the sliding door as quietly as she could. "Put your shoes and your coat on now. Run through the trees as fast as you can. Do you understand?" Tina nodded, fear filling her brown eyes.
He won't hurt us, Mummy, will he? The owner, I mean."
"Of course he's not going to hurt us, sweetheart," said Chloe, "but we don't want him to see us. We need to get out of here before he finds us, so you've got to run as fast as you can." Chloe grabbed a torch and her revolver, which she tucked hurriedly into her parka. She could feel the ice-cold metal,
and was hoping to God that tonight she wasn't going to have to use it. But she would if the worst came to the worst. They needed to make their way safely back to the car that was well hidden behind some trees a far way back. She could only hope that Eddie did not know where it was hidden, because if he did, they'd be in serious trouble. Chloe and her daughter ran as fast as they could. Luckily, with the cabin nestled between the trees, there were so many places to hide, for there were trees everywhere. They could hide in plain sight, especially under the cover of darkness. As they were escaping, they had heard the ominous sound of thunderous boots thumping through the cabin, as floorboards creaked and groaned under Eddie's ponderous weight. Eddie was assuming that Chloe and her daughter were sleeping in the upstairs bedroom, but every night they slept in a small little living room with a large fireplace and an easy accessible rear sliding door that gave them a fleeting advantage to escape. So with their hearts thundering through their chests, Chloe had rolled back that door, and they had literally just disappeared into the woods. It was then that Chloe heard a familiar voice booming through the trees. She had not heard that voice in a very long time, and she knew the brutal truth. The voice was unmistakably Eddie's.
"Run all you like, Chloe. I'll find you. Like I found your car with my tracker. I told you I'd hunt you down and make you pay for what you did. Didn't I say? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Vengeance is mine."
Chloe ran past the makeshift barn, where all the firewood was stored. She considered hiding in there with her daughter, but with 4 walls on every side, they could so easily be cornered by Eddie Jones. So they zigzagged somewhat haphazardly and rather precariously through the trees, both frozen more by fear than the elements themselves. But a desire to escape overcame every other primal instinct. It was difficult to run, with only a flicker of a torchlight guiding them through the trees. But Eddie was close behind them. They could hear his feet getting closer and closer, along with his heavy breathing. "Hide," said Chloe, pushing her daughter behind a tree. "Stay very still. Don't let him see you. Don't move." With their hearts beating furiously in their chests, mother and daughter hid behind an old maple tree, peering around the corner to see if they could see anything. But only a sliver of moonlight danced through the trees. Then they saw the bright, blaring light of a very powerful spotlight trespassing through the trees with an aggressive illumination, so that every single corner was not overlooked, and Chloe's heart sank as she realized that their cover was likely to be blown. She rested her hand on the revolver and was about to pull it out of her pocket, and then there he was, standing before them. Eddie Jones, the man she'd experienced nightmares about since she was a little girl of 9 years old. He was now standing before her, larger than life, in the flesh. He was stockier than she remembered, his face covered in fine lines, for age had robbed him of the handsomeness that had so easily seduced her mother. But now, like the autumn leaves on the vine maples, his good looks had lasted only a season in his life. Now they had gone, but unlike the maple trees that would regain their magnificence again, Eddie's magnificence was a sorry memory. He was wearing a woolly cap over his head. His eyes were as mean and as dark as Chloe remembered them to be. As a 9-year-old girl, her mother had been right. Eyes were indeed the windows of the soul, for Eddie's eyes betrayed that fact, for there was no good in them at all. Eddie gave Chloe a gormless grin.
"My, we have grown quite a lot, haven't we, Chloe? The last time I saw you, you were a 9-year-old girl. Look at you now, a prize bitch like your mother you were. 2 peas in a bloody pod. You even look like her too. It's quite startling, really, although you're a tad less brassy than your mother was. She thought she was bloody Marilyn Monroe, your mother. What a joke. Marilyn Monroe was a stunner. Your mother, just a cheap reproduction."
"What do you want, Eddie?" Chloe growled.
"I'm here, Chloe. What do you think I want? To get my revenge. Do you think I'd come all this way to track you out here for nothing at all? I think I've got better things to do with my time. Remember, I was locked in prison for a long time, thanks to you." Eddie pulled out a revolver from his pocket, and before Chloe could even have time to react, he placed it at her temple. It was too late for her to draw out her revolver. She hadn't been quick enough on the uptake. Eddie's eyes were firmly pinned on her, so she couldn't just slip her fingers into her pockets without him being aware of her movements. What the hell was she going to do? She felt like a cornered animal. She was trapped. How could she escape the likes of Eddie Jones?
"Please don't hurt my mama,"
came Tina's frantic cries.
"Don't hurt my mama. I'm sorry we stayed in your cabin, but please don't be mad with mama,"
said Tina, tears rolling down her cheeks. All of a sudden, Chloe could see a tall, dark, ambiguous silhouette moving through the trees. Someone was out here, in the middle of the night. "Help!" she cried out. "Please help! He's going to kill us! He's going to kill us!" She thought she was calling out to a person, but as the obscure figure moved towards them, to her amazement, Chloe discovered she'd called out to Bigfoot. Eddie was mocking her. "Sorry, Chloe. I don't think anybody's going to save you now. It's too late for that." Chloe was so stunned by what she was seeing. In the light of Eddie's flashlight, she could see the figure clearly. The Bigfoot was now standing over Eddie. It looked like he meant business. Eddie, on seeing the bewildered expression on Chloe's face, turned around, and this time he saw the Bigfoot looming over him. Eddie let out a shrill scream. He tried to fire at the Bigfoot with his revolver, but his gun refused to give off any bullets. It appeared to be jammed. "Oh my God! A bloody Bigfoot!" were the last words that ever came out of Eddie Jones's mouth. The Bigfoot grabbed him, smashing his head against a tree, and Eddie was finally put out of his misery. He lay there limp on the ground, his body motionless, his eyes glazed over like a dead fish. Mother and daughter both stared at the Bigfoot incredulously, not knowing whether to be grateful or afraid. Would the Bigfoot turn his wrath on them too? The creature was so human-looking, easily 9 foot tall, possibly taller, with long flowing dark hair and a powerful male energy. A voice boomed out of his throat as the creature spoke in an idiosyncratic, rather strange language, but Chloe and her daughter understood every word he spoke. "Matela tuasaka, tasakalakwa, tuasakalakwa." Very, very bad man. I knew he was bad when he came here. He's been hiding in the trees all day, waiting and waiting, but I've been watching him. When he came after you tonight, I could see the murder written in his heart. So when he followed you into the woods, I killed him. Now let me lead you back to your cabin safely. I know your eyes are not good for the dark like mine are. Please follow me. Gasquali catolo maginasi, hatila quasa shinasi, hola picasila. Tina ran up to the Bigfoot. The little girl threw her arms into his coat, crying into his long hair. It would seem her daughter was not remotely intimidated by this large, tall, towering creature, and she said the moment she saw him, it was like she was seeing a great big lovely teddy bear who'd come to save them both, and save them he did. The Bigfoot led them back to the cabin, and then said to them, "Galituasika, Yulotopa, may the good Lord be with you." And then he was gone, just like that. But that night both Chloe and Tina believed the Bigfoot had been to them an angel sent by God himself. Weeks later there was a report in the paper about the body of Eddie Jones, convicted of the attempted murder of his ex-girlfriend, whom had been released from prison, was found lying dead in the woods near a cabin where he'd been hiding out that had not been used by the owner for a few years. The autopsy report said he'd been bludgeoned to death. No one knew the truth, of course, about what really happened that night, apart from Tina and Chloe, but it would seem a lot of people could sleep safely in their beds at night, now that Eddie Jones was finally out of the picture. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story.
I can't imagine what that poor little 8-year-old girl must have felt to see her mother being strangled to death and having to stab that awful man Eddie with her scissors in order to stop that behaviour. And frankly, that man was after for a revenge, and he came after Chloe, and she was so lucky that she was spared by that Bigfoot. So maybe there are angels among us. Until next time, goodbye and good night.